So in this video, we are looking at Locke's essay, Book 4, chapters 17 to 19. And we're dealing with the ideas or the concepts of faith and reason. This is basically where Locke, shall we say, lets loose a little bit, and we'll see just how far we've come from the original, hardcore empiricist line that Locke articulates way back in Book 1. Now, first thing, as we're talking about faith and reason, let's have a look here at reason. So in chapter 17, Locke says, all right, reason, yes, this term has lots of different uses, and he gives you a variety of examples. But for Locke, it's going to be a faculty of the mind. That is a power. But Locke says something like this. Well, we've seen that that the mind has, various other kinds of powers, and this power of perception, and all these things that Locke talks about. And he says we get knowledge off the ground, so to speak, with simple perceptions. Recall where we talk about black is not white, and these ideas that we have that the mind can perceive similarities and differences and do a little bit of discerning. So Locke is going over some ground that he's already talked about, but here he poses the question quite bluntly. He said, why do we really need reason? What is it for? What's the point of it? Now keep in mind that Locke always asks these kinds of questions, like what's the point of something, which betrays, shall we say, a hidden teleological presupposition, which in turn betrays sort of an ordering of the universe, which in turn betrays a grand metaphysical position that there's some kind of controlling deity. And rest assured, Locke thinks there is. Now, this notion of the deity will come out quite strongly in this. I like to call these last bits, especially chapter 19, the preacher passages, where, as I said, Locke really cuts loose. But before we get to that, what's the point of reason? It's clearly very important. It enlarges our knowledge. So it allows us to go beyond simple propositions like white is not black and things like that we can readily see, and to do advanced mathematics and to do physics. You need reason for that. You're not going to be able to do that with the very basic faculties of the mind that he articulated earlier. So reason enlarges our knowledge and regulates assent. So it enlarges. It's not the only thing that gives us knowledge, but it's the one that really allows us to have high-powered knowledge about the world. And it regulates assent. That's going to be very important. Reason is something that when new information comes in, how are you going to discern whether it's good information or bad information, whether you should believe it, whether you should assent, that is, accept it? You need reason for that. It's going to be extremely important, especially when we get into discussions of enthusiasm and faith. So that's going to be extremely important. It allows us also, that is, reason allows us to see ideas as probably linked, low levels of reason, necessarily linked, mathematics, higher levels of physics. That's going to be a higher application of reason. Now, Locke goes into a number of analyses of the concept of reason. We've seen him talk like this before. You can go and have a look at, Locke thinks there are various degrees of reason. So reason is not for, let's say as it was for Plato, this more or less all or nothing idea. Knowledge was an all or nothing. Locke clearly doesn't think that. That he thinks that these concepts are internally differentiated, and part of his story here is to articulate how these concepts like reason and knowledge are internally differentiated and are not all or nothing affairs. Locke also, with regard to the ancients, with a nod towards the ancient, talks about syllogistic logic. Now, syllogistic logic is often called Aristotelian logic. They're not identical, but the history of logic is quite large and complicated, and Locke doesn't go into too many details, and I doubt that Locke was aware of all the complexities of medieval logic, for instance. I think he would have had a fairly standard view of medieval logic, that it is more or less just a small articulation of Aristotelian logic or syllogistic logic. Now, we now know today much more about medieval logic than I suspect Locke ever did. And to say that medieval logic is just simply syllogistic logic is it's incorrect. In any case, what's Locke's point here? Locke wants to talk about syllogistic logic because it was regarded as, absolutely crucial, sufficient for reasoning, necessary for reasoning. That reason really was an instantiation of this kind of logic that came from Aristotle. And Locke says, is it true that syllogistic logic is the best and natural use of our reason? And he wants to say no. He says that there are various causes, he articulates a couple of them, as to why people thought we should be studying this. And Locke articulates these reasons, or these causes, as he calls them, for studying syllogistic logic, and he refutes them. He says that, in the end, it's not really important. He says that, what is the syllogism? It's basically a logical structure that we use, and we have different forms of this logical structure. So they're often called modes, or different kinds of the forms that syllogisms can take. And he says that, look, they're not necessary for reasoning because we don't have to always squeeze our thinking into these various forms. Locke says, there's people in Asia and America, so he refers to people outside of, shall we say, his own culture, or maybe Western culture. Locke probably didn't have clearly articulated notions of this, but let's say for the purpose of discussion, when he says about people other than us, he's more or less talking about the Western philosophical tradition. So he says that people in the Americas, people in Asia are just as good at reasoning as we are. They don't talk about syllogisms. They don't use it. Now again, Locke would not have had probably a very good understanding of Eastern philosophies, because they did a lot of logic too. But his point is still, I think, a fairly good one, is that lots of people reason, they do it well, they don't use syllogistic logic to reason. So therefore, syllogistic logic, simply put, cannot be necessary for good reasoning. People do without it. Now, also, Locke says, a little bit of sarcasm too. He said, what do you think? God just had people wandering around reasoning poorly until Aristotle came along and constructed syllogistic logic, and then all of a sudden people started to reason well? That seems a bit absurd. So Locke says, God wouldn't do that. Let people just wander around until Aristotle comes and shows us the light of syllogistic logic. So the syllogism, Locke says, yeah, it can be important, but don't overinflate its value and say that it's absolutely necessary. It's clearly it's not necessary. Is it sufficient? Sure, it'll do well. But Locke thinks at the end of it all that reason is going to be something that has a deeper reach than the forms of the syllogism have. So in that sense, it's an artificial type of construction. Sure, Aristotle is someone that Locke deeply admires, and he says, no question, this guy was one of the greats of antiquity, one of the great philosophers, and we should study him. And yes, probably in principle, you can reduce reasoning down to syllogistic logic, but you don't have to. So Locke has sort of got a love-hate relationship with syllogism. Now, but, don't kid yourself. As much as Locke praises reason, he says that reason can allow us to penetrate the depths of the seas and to soar as high as the stars in the heavens. He's got a lot of respect for reason, but he's no blind worshiper of reason. Now, we've seen him earlier talk about how reason is important, and reason, as I said, he's not a blind worshiper. Reason is good enough for life. That is, if you want to have a good life, to be moral, if you want to have a good life in terms of building houses and roads and whatever, that you can get your horses and your goods to market, you can regulate, you have good government and all that, reason can do it. It may not be able to answer everything that we ask of it, because we can imagine, we can desire, and that can just be overflowing. And we shouldn't get mad if reason can't handle all that. But, as Locke says, God gave us reason, and our God-given reason, he's very clear about that, is good enough for a good life. And sometimes you just have to rest content with what you're given and not keep squawking about it. So, reason is good enough for life, and Locke says it often fails us. He gives several examples of how reason, as a matter of fact, he gives, I think, 5 examples of how reason fails us. I'll look at a couple. If your ideas fail, reason fails. Reason is only going to be as good as the ideas that it's operating on. If your ideas are totally wrong, totally inaccurate, go ahead and reason all you want on those. It's not going to really get you anywhere. It's certainly not going to lead you to truth. Now, Locke also is aware of a distinction that we might, somewhat aware of a distinction that we would now say is between validity and soundness. An argument can be perfectly logical. That is, that its premises, if they're assumed to be true, necessarily force by logic the truth of the conclusion. Argument is sometimes called truth-preserving. A valid argument does this. Locke seems to be aware of this. But he's also aware that an argument can be valid, but it's not a good argument. Why? Because the premises that are involved are not sound. That is, the premises are not true. Maybe they say falsities, and from falsities you can derive other falsities. But in logic, we say if the premises are assumed to be true and the conclusion must be true, the argument is valid. Still doesn't make it a good argument. Locke seems to be aware of this problem as well, that logic is kind of like a shell that if everything fits a form, it'll all go through, but still doesn't mean it's a good argument. Reason still has to come in and ask, are these premises true? Now, Locke also goes on and discusses when reason can typically go wrong, that arguments that are often used, quite common, and they're, shall we say, counterfeit arguments. These kinds of counterfeit arguments, they're arguments that they're not real arguments. They are counterfeit in the sense that they appear to be good arguments, but in the end they're bad arguments, but they're common. And in this sense, they are, shall we say, shells of bad arguments because they take different content. And Locke says we should pay attention to these. These are often called fallacies. And Locke looks at a number of these fallacies and how when they show, and he shows how they go wrong in reasoning. So he looks at 4 of the classic fallacies. There's far more of these, but Locke is aware of how reason can, we say, sort of corrupted and can go wrong and instantiated in various places. So be careful of your fallacies, Locke says. Now, Locke concludes chapter 17 with a discussion, shall we say, of the territory surrounding the notion of reason. So you can have propositions that are according to reason, and a proposition that's according to reason is something that can be deduced and traced back, if you like, to experience, and ultimately can be unpacked, analyzed out into simple ideas and their relationships. That's a very solid, reason-backed, experience-backed result. That's probably the best form of knowledge that we have. However, there's another territory that surrounds reason, and that is not propositions that are derived from them, but propositions that are, shall we say, metaphorically speaking, are above reason. These would be certain kinds of theological propositions which can only be given by revelation, and they don't contradict reason, but reason has nothing to say about them. So you can think of certain propositions that reason could never confirm or deny because maybe they are unique elements in the universe. They can't be repeated. They don't fit into the scientific method. You can't reason about them. They are matters of faith. We'll talk a little bit more about faith in a bit. But these would be things that don't contradict, that reason doesn't contradict, but reason just doesn't handle. So there would be some things for Locke that science, in our sense of modern science, natural science, empirical science, that propositions it can't handle, it can't answer because they're not amenable to the scientific method. So these are propositions that are above reason, but they don't contradict reason. And there would be ones that are contrary, that do clash with reason. So you have propositions that are derived from reason, propositions that are above reason, and now propositions that are directly contrary to reason, and those ones you have to be careful of because reason is your in a sense you're sovereign. You should be respectful of it, But it's not an absolute dictator because remember, Locke doesn't have a blind worship of reason. But if reason clearly clashes with something, you probably should reject it. Now, Locke says reason is also often, and again, I'm still in 17, reason is often opposed to faith. And that's not a good thing because real reason, true, shall we say, for Locke, real faith, right? This is true faith. The true faith is actually grounded on reason. So yes, there might be things that you have in your belief system, certain propositions that cannot be derived by reason, but they don't conflict with reason. There would be other propositions that you can clearly derive. And the big one, God exists, and these kinds of, shall we say, bedrock theological propositions, Locke says that you don't take those merely on faith in the sense of a faith devoid of reason. No, that faith is grounded on reason. So real proper faith is grounded, connected to, works with reason. So there's ultimately no opposition. Now, we often say, oh, the opposition of reason and faith. Well, the medievals struggled with this opposition as well, and they put together a picture which is not entirely dissimilar to Locke's. But the average, everyday, casual way of speaking about faith and reason sets them up as opposites. They clash, right? The clash of faith and reason. We always hear about that. So Locke says in chapter 18, okay, let's look a little bit at faith in the everyday sense. Remember, this is not Locke's view. This is not what Locke thinks faith really should be. But he says, okay, what are we talking about faith in the everyday sense? And he offers his take on this. He said that faith in the everyday sense is when you're assenting, you're agreeing, you're accepting a proposition as coming from God. But, it's grounded in like someone tells you, oh, God told me this, or some expression of the divine will, someone's telling you about it, and it's grounded on the proposer's character, whoever is up there on the stage doing their thing, telling you about what God thinks or some rule. Maybe in some way you've heard it or whatever, but the important point is that it's not grounded on reason. So it's some kind of proposition that's coming forth, and it's not grounded on reason. This is a kind of revelation. Locke uses the term revelation in a lot of different places, and he's probably not entirely consistent, but this is a kind of revelation. And Locke talks about this. What are we trying to do here? Like, God can easily put ideas in our mind. He can put simple ideas in our mind. For us, though, we can't do that. We can only do that through experience. So I can't put a simple idea in your mind with my language. The only thing I can do with my language is get you to call up simple ideas because I use a word like blue that you recognize and it's tied to an idea in your mind. So I can't convey the concept of a true revelation according to Locke, because a true revelation would have some kinds of ideas that aren't from regular experience. But God could put those ideas in my mind, but I can't do that for you. So I can't really transmit the notion of real revelation to anyone. You'd have to get it from God yourself. God can do it, of course. There's no limit on what God can do. But if I get an original revelation, I can't pass it on to you. I can talk about it, but you wouldn't really know what I'm talking about because the words that I'm using don't correspond to ideas that you have. So Locke ultimately has a traditional kind of notion of the relationship between reason and revelation, and it's similar, as I mentioned earlier, to what you can find in people like Aquinas. Now, faith can't contradict reason in moving our assent. If you solidly perceived a truth and you've reasoned it through, faith in this bad sense is not going to contradict it. Locke seems to have this kind of notion that if you truly embrace reason, it's going to run the show. You might recognize its limitations, but within its sphere of proper influence, it's going to run the show. And you may recognize that outside its sphere of proper influence, again, propositions that are above, you can accept those. So we've again, so the battle of God with God's battle with the fallen angels and all these kinds of things. Those are theological, explicitly theological propositions that have to be revealed. They can't be proven or disproven by reason. Again, this is pretty well what the medievals were saying. So Locke is very concerned about religion. Because in his time, there were lots of religious wars. There was lots of struggles with it. So he wanted to get rid of that innate stuff, and he wanted to pull religion over, that it has to be coupled to reason so that we can talk about it, we can disagree, we can agree, we can talk about it and argue about it without killing each other over it. And Locke says that religion's a great thing. Don't get him wrong. He thinks it's a great thing when it's linked to reason, and when you have this rationally informed faith, you get something that elevates us above the brutes, where it makes us, in a sense, a truly human, according to Locke. That it makes us become truly human and elevates us above the brutes, Locke's word for animals. And the dark side of religion is once it's uncoupled, once it's freed of its shackles of reason, then that is a very dangerous thing. That leads to war and darkness, and ultimately leads to us being below the brutes. We're worse than animals if we have unshackled, reasonless religion. So, with that in mind, Locke says that you got to be careful. Everything should be linked to reason, and faith is grounded in reason. So in chapter 19, he's going to look at what he calls enthusiasm. And I like to call chapter 19, there's sort of the preacher passages. Locke really lets loose about some of his concerns, and his Christianity more or less it roars out in this chapter. So if you think Locke is an atheist, read this and you'll not think that anymore. Now, Locke says if one abandons reason, you cut out natural knowledge, all the good stuff we've been talking about, you yank proper faith from its roots, which are, again, back in reason, it's going to be deeply problematic. And once you do that, once this sort of religious tendency in us is cut loose, that's what you get. You get enthusiasm. This is the third basis of opinion. You either have straight reason or reason leading to faith, so that's 1 and 2. This one is cut free, and it's your third basis. That's enthusiasm, right? And in this sense, it's freed. This is the mind that's freed by a check on reason. It's tempting. It's easy, right? It's really easy. Reason's hard. It's difficult. And it's a little dull, too. And why is it so dull and hard? Because it puts the brakes on these natural tendencies to believe these things. We, as a species, for Locke, we have this natural rush to believe things. We believe too much, not too little. We tend to easily believe things. And as John Dewey would say, a couple centuries later, critical thinking and reasoning is to put the brakes on the natural inertia to believe, and that's painful. I want to believe, right? Oh no, my reason is putting the brakes. If you get used to living without the brakes of reason, your natural inertia to believe and superstitions just runs rampant, and it gets increasingly harder to put the brakes. So the more you live without reason, the more it is difficult to come back to reason. So get the kids while they're young, train them with reason so they get used to being comfortable within the boundaries of reason. So Locke says that enthusiasm flatters our laziness, our ignorance, and our vanity. You always think you're right. Why? Because of the strength of your own persuasions, right? I just feel it's right. And you feel that you're right because your feelings are strong. And why are your feelings strong? Because you're right. Well, clearly, as Locke points out, there's a circularity in all this. And that once you have, if you strip enthusiasm, you clearly see, strip enthusiasm of all the emotion and the rhetoric and all that, you clearly see it's just circularity. You just have strong convictions and you're totally convinced of your convictions. It's just clearly, there's no external check or whatever. It's the strength of our convictions, Locke says. It is no evidence of their truth. So when someone says, oh, I just feel it on my bones that I'm right, So what, Locke says. That's a big deal. People used to feel that all kinds of things in their bones as being true. We now know not true at all. So this cannot be taken as any thing that we can use. Locke and be serious as philosophers. So the true light in the mind is the evidence shining from the proposition. And this shining can only be an element of self-evidence or the support from reason in a demonstration. Something has to be self-evidently true. Again, it's a bit dicey with that. But to talk of any other light in the understanding, Locke says, is to put yourself in darkness. The strength of your own persuasions. This puts you in a vulnerable place. And here's where the preacher passage is. This means that you're more susceptible, Locke says, and he uses this kind of preacher language, to the darkness, to the prince of darkness, right? To Satan, who will come along and make you and lead you to believe all kinds of terrible things. You've cast off your armor of reason and left yourself open to the strength of your own convictions. How do you know that you're being influenced by Satan or the goodness of the Holy Spirit? The goodness. And so Locke says you don't know these things. So if you rely on the strength of your own convictions, that's dangerous territory. Reason must be the last judge, Locke says, of everything we do. If we think some revelation, if you think you're getting a revelation from God, Locke says, well, you got to check into this. Not necessarily its content, but how it comes to you. So Locke says that reason will be the judge and of whether or not this revelation is a true revelation or not. And Locke goes to biblical passages and he says, look, when Moses was getting revelations from God, he saw a burning bush and they were external marks, and also the rod that turned into a serpent. So these are things that reason can look at and go, yeah, this looks pretty good, that this is actual revelation. So reason has to agree that the revelation comes from God, whatever the content may be. But it has to agree that the revelation comes from God, and God doesn't trick us. He marks the revelation with things that reason would immediately recognize. So God, when he speaks to us according to Locke, is going to follow. He's going to speak to us ultimately through things that reason can recognize. He speaks to us in our own kind of language, if you like to put it that way. And our special own kind of language is the language of reason. And God is not going to force us outside and sort of outside the sovereignty of reason and speak to us that way. He doesn't do that. Although God, Locke admits, there's passages in the Bible where prophets clearly just were sent messages and they didn't have these external marks. So he's fudging a little bit on that. But in the end, note that Locke clearly says God does and has intervened in the world. And if you think back of the discussion of the very beginning of the essay, Locke's careful description of simple ideas, his careful arguments against innate ideas, innate propositions. It looked like a very austere, arid landscape that the mind is just simply operating on little ideas that come into this dark cupboard that Locke referred to the mind being in the senses. Open up a few drawers here and let some light in, and the mind operates on it. It looked to be quite a very sort of mechanical, kind of dull sort of picture of this sort of little clock-like mind just operating, or an engine operating on a little bit of gas. Now all of a sudden we're over here and Locke's talking about how God talks to us and how he talks to us in the language of reason, etc., etc. So these, shall we say, these preacher passages, as I like to call them, they throw Locke's earlier discussions into a different light. So if you go back and you read these early passages over again, you can see that Locke, he has a whole agenda in mind as he sets all this up. And this is another reason why I always advocate that when you are confronted with big books like this one's fairly big, we're putting it about 750 pages. what you always want to do is read into the dark passages at the back, right? And also at the, shall we say, the opening parts, like the foreword and the letter, the epistle to the reader here. It's a good thing to read around the edges of the book, because you get a good idea of what the whole personality is involved in trying to do. Like, what was Locke up to in this book? He's fighting a number of battles, and it's not just simply to square epistemology with science. He's got political and religious aspirations running throughout this book. But clearly, Locke is centering his epistemology firmly within, shall we say, a standard Christian overview. But again, always read the dark passages at the back, for that's a place where you may get a little glimpse of, or perhaps even a good insight into an author's deepest sentiments and possibly hidden positions.